The year was 1887, and the air in the high reaches of the Colorado Territories already carried the brittle premonition of winter. In Providence Gulch, a settlement clawed from the unyielding granite and pine of the mountains, this was a familiar and dreaded scent. It spoke of dwindling supplies, of the deep and killing cold that would soon seal the passes, isolating them utterly. For Elspeth Muir, it was the scent of a far more personal reckoning. A widow since the spring, when a mislaid charge of dynamite had turned the Liberty Mine into her husband Thomas's tomb, she had been cast out not by law, but by the colder, more efficient judgment of her neighbors. The charge had been theft, a sack of flour and 2 loaves of bread from Hiram Poole's mercantile. In a place where every grain was counted against the coming snows, it was a crime bordering on treason. Her quiet claim that Thomas had arranged credit before his final shift was dismissed as the fantasy of a grieving, desperate woman. So she was exiled to the edge of things, inhabiting a derelict miner's cabin at the far end of the gulch, a place where the pretense of community ended and the absolute authority of the wilderness began. It was here that the town's pity and scorn found their focus. Men riding out to check their trap lines or scout for timber would see her, a lone figure engaged in a baffling and seemingly lunatic enterprise. She was not mending the cabin's sagging roof, nor was she chinking the walls against the wind that already moaned through the gaps. Instead, with her husband's heavy pickaxe and shovel, she was attacking the sheer granite cliff face that rose up behind the cabin. Day after day she labored, not quarrying stone for a new hearth, but enlarging a narrow existing fissure in the rock. Her movements were slow, methodical, fueled by a purpose that was entirely opaque to anyone who watched. She was digging a hole in the side of a mountain, a burrow fit for a marmot, and the sight solidified the town's consensus. The poor woman's grief had finally broken her mind. Her 7-year-old son, Jamie, sometimes sat nearby, piling small stones into miniature walls, his small face a mask of solemn concentration that mirrored his mother's. They were a portrait of pointless, tragic industry. The first to confront her directly was Hiram Poole himself, a man whose piety was as hard and unyielding as the gold-flecked quartz he so admired. He reined in his horse, the creak of the saddle leather loud in the thin air, and looked down at her work. Elspeth, her face smudged with dirt and her dress hemmed with a thick layer of mud, did not stop her digging, the rhythmic scrape and clink of her shovel the only answer to his presence. "Mistress Muir," he said, his voice laced with the kind of condescending authority he reserved for children and the indigent. "The Lord's charity is not infinite, nor is the season for preparation. What is this folly? Are you digging your own grave to save the town the trouble?" He had meant it as a sharp, corrective prod, a reminder of her precarious position. Elspeth finally stopped, leaning on the shovel handle. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. "I am building a pantry, Mr. Poole, and an oven." Hiram Poole blinked, then let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. A pantry in the rock. An oven. It was worse than he thought. It was not just madness. It was a defiant, nonsensical madness. He shook his head, a gesture of finality. "Winter will not care for your fancies, madam. It will find the gaps in your walls and the emptiness in your larder all the same." He rode off, the incident already forming into a cautionary tale he would share with the men at the saloon, another piece of evidence in the case against the widow Muir's sanity. His words, and the variations of them that soon followed, became the talk of Providence Gulch. Dorothea Weiss, whose husband ran the assay office, and who considered herself the final arbiter of social standing, saw Elspeth from a distance while gathering late-season berries. She saw the widow hauling buckets of thick, gray clay up from the creek bed, her back bowed with effort. Later, she saw her dragging fallen aspen logs, their pale bark stark against the darkening earth. "It is a tragedy," Dorothea pronounced to a small audience at the Mercantile, her voice dripping with performative sympathy. Her mind has snapped. Grief does that to the weaker sex. She thinks she can live in the mountain like a bear. Poor thing, and that poor child. This narrative, a blend of pity and morbid fascination, took root. Elspeth became a local curiosity, a living ghost story. Children were warned not to go near the widow's cabin, lest her madness prove catching. She was no longer just an outcast accused of theft. She was the mad woman of the Gulch, a figure as wild and unpredictable as the landscape she was trying to tame. Only one person approached her without a prepared judgment. Constance Hartwell, the blacksmith's wife, was a quiet woman who possessed a deep, unspoken skepticism for the town's swift and certain verdicts. She had known Thomas Muir to be an honest man, and she found it hard to believe his wife was a common thief. One afternoon, she walked the long track to the cabin, carrying a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She found Elspeth not digging, but on her hands and knees at the entrance to her rock cavity, her arms coated to the elbows in the wet, gray clay she had hauled from the creek. She was smoothing it onto the interior walls of the chamber she had carved out, her touch firm and precise. Constance stood for a moment, watching the strange, sculptural work. "Elspeth," she said softly. Elspeth looked up, startled. She wiped a hand across her forehead, leaving a muddy streak. Constance held out the bundle. "I brought some dried beans and some salt." Elspeth took them with a nod of thanks, her gaze wary. "They say you are building a house in the rock," Constance said, her tone gentle, inquisitive rather than accusatory. "No," Elspeth replied, her voice rough from disuse. "Not a house. Something else." She looked at the cavity, then back at Constance. "The stone remembers," she said, as if that explained everything. Constance, of course, did not understand. A rock was a cold thing. But she saw the fierce, lucid intelligence in Elspeth's eyes, and it did not look like madness. It looked like certainty. That certainty was not born of desperation, but of memory. As she worked, her mind was often far from Providence Gulch, back in the slate-roofed village of her childhood, in a land of green hills and ancient stones. Her father had been a baker, but he was a stonemason first. He understood the deep, slow life of the earth in a way no one in this raw, new country seemed to. He had not built with timber frames and clapboard, but with stone that had been settled for 1,000 years. He taught her to read the grain in a rock as others read a book, to understand its properties not just of hardness, but of memory. One cool autumn evening when she was a girl, he had taken her to the great bake oven he had built at the back of their cottage, a massive dome of stone and clay. The fire had been out for 2 full days, yet when he opened the heavy iron door, a wave of profound warmth washed over them. "Feel that, Elspeth," he had murmured, his hand on her shoulder. "The fire is gone, but the stone remembers the heat. It holds it deep inside. It doesn't forget like the air does. It gives it back, slow, steady. That is the secret. The earth is a great, warm heart, if you know how to listen to it." This was the principle, the secret knowledge that guided her hands now. She was not merely digging a hole. She was tapping into the vast thermal battery of the mountain itself. All summer, the sun had beaten down on the immense granite face, and that heat had not simply vanished. It had soaked deep into the rock, a reservoir of warmth that would bleed out slowly through the long, cold months of winter. The chamber she was carving was not a cave that would trap the cold, but an antechamber to the mountain's deep, latent heat. The clay she was lining it with was not for decoration. It was for insulation and reflection. Dug from a specific bend in the creek where the deposits were finest, she worked it with water and a little sand, puddling it with her feet just as her father had taught her, until it had the perfect plastic consistency. This clay, when dried and cured by slow fire, would become a kind of ceramic, turning the rough-hewn walls into a smooth, sealed surface that would hold and radiate heat, preventing the warmth from being immediately swallowed by the raw stone. Her creation was a geothermal pantry, a space that would naturally maintain a temperature well above freezing even when the world outside was locked in ice. The oven she planned to build within it was an extension of the same idea. In Providence Gulch, baking was a constant battle against the cold. Ovens were inefficient, fuel-hungry beasts that leached heat into the frigid air of the cabin as quickly as it was produced. But an oven built inside her insulated rock chamber would be a different creature altogether. The ambient warmth of the earth-warmed space would mean the oven would not have to fight the cold from the start. It would require a fraction of the wood to reach temperature, and the thick, clay-lined stone walls of the mountains surrounding it would ensure that once hot, it would stay hot for hours, even days. It was a system of profound efficiency, born of an understanding that went deeper than the simple mechanics of fire and flour. It was a partnership with the mountain itself. She had tried to explain a piece of this to Constance Hartwell with those three simple words: "The stone remembers." But she saw in Constance's kind, uncomprehending eyes that the concept was too foreign. Here, the mountain was an obstacle to be blasted, drilled, and stripped of its treasure. The idea that it could be a source of gentle, persistent warmth was a language no one else in the gulch spoke. She knew then that her vindication would not come from explanation. It would have to be baked into a loaf of bread. The labor was immense, a daily tax on a body already thinned by grief and meager rations. Each morning before the sun crested the sharp eastern ridge, she was outside, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The excavation was the hardest part. The granite was ancient and unforgiving. She learned to find the smaller fractures, the lines of weakness, and work her pickaxe into them, using leverage and persistence instead of brute force. The shock of the impact traveled up the hickory handle into the bones of her arms and shoulders, a jarring, resonant ache that lived with her day and night. She moved tons of rock and earth, one shovelful at a time, her world shrinking to the few square feet of her task. Jamie, her silent companion, would help, carrying smaller stones in his arms, his face set with a fierce and childish gravity. He did not understand the principle any more than Constance had, but he understood the purpose. This was their fortress against the coming cold, their answer to the town that had turned its back on them. Sourcing the materials was a journey in itself. The clay was a 2-mile round trip down to the rushing creek that flowed through the bottom of the gulch. She would dig it out with her shovel, the cold water seeping into her worn boots, and haul it back up the steep incline in 2 heavy wooden buckets yoked across her shoulders. Her back and legs screamed in protest, but with each trip, she saw the pile of precious gray earth grow, the raw material of her salvation. For the door and shelving, she scavenged the forest floor, looking for seasoned deadfall, aspen and pine that had been felled by wind or age. She had no horse to drag the logs, so she would lever them onto smaller rollers and push, or sometimes drag them by rope, the bark scraping grooves into the hard, packed earth. She learned to use her husband's saw and adze, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused and strong. She shaped the planks, her cuts rough but functional, fitting them together to form a thick, heavy door, which she insulated by stuffing the gaps between 2 layers of wood with dried moss and bracken. The construction phase was a work of quiet artistry. After excavating a chamber roughly 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and tall enough for her to stand upright, she began applying the clay. She mixed it in a shallow pit, adding water and stamping it down until it was a smooth, dense paste. Then, handful by handful, she plastered the interior, pressing the clay into every crevice of the rough stone, building up a layer nearly a foot thick on the walls and ceiling. It was cool, messy work, the clay sucking the warmth from her fingers. At the very back of this chamber, she built the oven. She laid a floor of carefully selected flat stones, then constructed a low, domed chamber on top of it, using smaller rocks mortared together with more of the thick clay. She fashioned a rudimentary flue from old tin cans that Thomas had saved, punching holes in the ends and fitting them together to create a pipe that she angled up through a natural crack in the rock above, sealing it with yet more clay. For weeks, the chamber was a damp, dark space that smelled of wet earth and raw minerals. Then came the curing. She built a series of small, slow fires, first in the center of the room, and then inside the oven itself. It was a delicate process. Too much heat too soon, and the clay would crack and crumble. It had to be a gradual introduction of warmth, a slow baking of the very walls around her. Day after day, she tended these little fires, the smoke filling the chamber before finding its way out the flue, until the gray clay walls slowly transformed, hardening and lightening in color to a pale terracotta red. The air inside lost its damp chill, replaced by a dry, earthy warmth and the faint, clean scent of fired clay. She had done it. She had built her sanctuary. Autumn did not fade gently that year. It broke. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a crisp, cloudless blue, turned the color of a dull pewter bowl. The wind, which had been a mere whisper, rose to a mournful howl, carrying with it the first hard, stinging pellets of snow. This was no gentle flurry. It was the arrival of the enemy. The old-timers in Providence Gulch knew the signs. This was a white death blizzard, a storm that came not to blanket the world in beauty, but to scour it clean. Within hours, the gulch was a maelstrom of screaming wind and blinding snow. The world shrank to the few feet visible beyond one's window. The town hunkered down, the flicker of lamplight in their cabins a fragile defiance against the overwhelming power of the storm. For Elspeth, this was the moment of truth. Her pantry was stocked with her meager supplies, the last of the flour she had managed to trade for, her small crock of sourdough starter, a few root vegetables, and a pail of fresh water. The heavy, moss-stuffed door was barred shut. The crucible had arrived. For 3 days the storm raged without pause. The wind shrieked, and the snow piled in immense, sculpted drifts against the north wall of her small cabin. Inside, she and Jamie lived in a world of semi-darkness, the single window a plastered white square. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the walls, making the very air ache. They huddled by the small stove, feeding it sparingly with the wood she had so painstakingly gathered. But while a part of her was in the cabin, weathering the storm, her mind was in the chamber behind it, in the silent, dark space she had built. Had the clay held? Was the door sealed tightly enough against the wind? Was her father's principle, a memory from a softer, greener land, strong enough to stand against the raw, brutal power of a Rocky Mountain blizzard? There was no way to know. She could not check on it, could not measure its performance. All she could do was wait, to trust in the memory of the stone, in the integrity of her own labor. It was a profound test of faith, a silent wager against the storm and the skepticism of the entire town. She felt a strange calm settle over her. She had done the work. The outcome was no longer in her hands. On the fourth day, the wind lessened its assault, its shriek diminishing to a low, guttural moan. The snowfall eased, and a pale, ethereal light began to filter through the snow-caked window. It was not over, but there was a lull, a breath in the storm's fury. Elspeth bundled herself in every layer she possessed, and, telling Jamie to stay close to the stove, she took up her shovel and forced open the cabin door. A wall of snow, taller than she was, greeted her. It took her the better part of an hour to carve a narrow trench from her door to the rock face. The snow so deep and light, it was like digging in sugar. Finally, she reached the wooden door to her chamber. It was crusted with ice, but the drift before it was smaller than the one against the cabin, sheltered by the rock overhang. With a grunt of effort, she cleared the snow away and pulled the heavy bar. The door swung inward with a soft scrape. She braced herself for a blast of frigid air, the same killing cold that permeated everything else in the world. But the air that met her was not frozen. It was cool, still, and damp, smelling of earth and baked clay, but it was distinctly, miraculously, not freezing. She stepped inside, into the near-total darkness, and closed the heavy door behind her, plunging the world into a sudden, profound silence. The roar of the wind vanished. Here, inside the mountain's heart, the storm did not exist. She lit a small lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows and revealing the smooth, reddish walls of her sanctuary. She ran a bare hand over the clay. It was cool to the touch, but it was the coolness of a cellar in summer, not the biting cold of the winter world outside. Her principle had held. The mountain had remembered the warmth. With a sense of reverence, she turned her attention to the oven. She had brought in a small supply of dry, split pine before the storm, and she laid a careful fire on the oven's stone hearth. Not a large, roaring blaze, but a small, concentrated pyre of wood that would produce a deep bed of glowing coals. Her movements were unhurried, economical. This was a demonstration of mastery, not a desperate fight for warmth. While the fire caught and grew, she uncovered her flour and her starter, a living, bubbling culture she had nurtured for weeks. In the steady, calm air of the chamber, shielded from the drafts and the invasive cold of the cabin, she began to mix her dough. Her hands, sure and practiced, worked the flour, water, and starter together, the rhythmic kneading a quiet prayer of gratitude. The dough came alive under her touch, smooth and elastic. She shaped it into 2 round loaves and left them to rise near the growing warmth of the oven. When the fire had burned down to a thick bed of incandescent coals, she carefully swept them out into a metal bucket. The oven was ready. The stones of its hearth and the clay of its dome radiated an intense, stored heat. She slid the 2 risen loaves from her wooden peel onto the hot stone floor and quickly sealed the oven's opening with a flat, clay-plugged stone. And then she waited. Inside the small, sealed chamber, a new scent began to fill the air. A scent she had only been able to dream of for months. It was the rich, nutty, almost sweet aroma of baking bread, a smell of life, of home, of civilization itself. It grew stronger, more complex, a defiant perfume against the sterile cold that gripped the world outside. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than half an hour, she opened the oven. A billow of fragrant steam rushed out. Using her peel, she drew out the first loaf. It was perfect. The crust was a deep, burnished gold, blistered and crackled, and it sang to her, a tiny, high-pitched crackling sound as the crust cooled. It was the sound of success. She carried the loaf, almost too hot to hold, back through the snow trench to the cabin. Jamie, who had been huddled by the stove, looked up, his eyes wide. The scent filled their small, cold room, overwhelming the smells of wood smoke and damp wool. Elspeth placed the loaf on the rough-hewn table, and with a knife, she cut into it. The crisp crust shattered, revealing a soft, creamy, steaming interior. The sensory proof was absolute. She handed a thick slice to Jamie and took one for herself. They ate in silence, the warmth of the bread spreading through them, a heat that was more than just physical. It was the taste of vindication. It was the flavor of a principle proven true, of a memory honored, of a desperate gamble that had paid off. As she chewed the soft, yielding crumb and the crisp, flavorful crust, she thought of her father's hands, caked with flour and stone dust. He had been right. The stone remembered. She had listened to its slow, deep wisdom, and it had given her this. In the heart of the blizzard, in a cabin at the edge of nowhere, shunned and pitied by all, Elspeth Muir had performed a miracle of thermodynamics, and it tasted like bread. When the blizzard finally broke, it left behind a world transformed, buried under a silent, monolithic blanket of white. The cold that followed was even more dangerous, a still, crystalline cold that shattered wood and froze a man's breath in his lungs. Providence Gulch was utterly cut off, an island in a sea of snow, and it was hungry. The early vicious storm had caught many unprepared. Stockpiles of food and firewood were dwindling at an alarming rate. It was in this cold, hungry silence that a new scent began to drift on the air at the edge of town, a faint but unmistakable aroma of baking bread. Constance Hartwell, her own family's larder reduced to salted pork and hardtack, was the first to follow it. She bundled up and made the difficult trek through the deep snow, her hope a fragile thing. She found Elspeth not starving or frozen, but pulling another batch of perfect, golden brown loaves from her hidden oven, the air around her warm and fragrant. Elspeth saw her, and without a word, she wrapped one of the hot loaves in a clean cloth and handed it to Constance. It was not charity. It was a simple statement of fact. The loaf of bread was a revelation in the Hartwell cabin, its impossible warmth and flavor a stark contrast to their grim reality. Constance's husband, the blacksmith, a man of few words and great practicality, simply held a piece of it, felt its texture, and nodded slowly. The news traveled quickly, a whispered rumor of the madwoman's miracle. Soon, others came, their pride swallowed by the gnawing hunger in their bellies and the cries of their children. They trudged through the snow, uncertain and ashamed, and to each of them, Elspeth gave bread. She did not ask for payment, not yet. She simply gave. Among the last to come was Hiram Poole. He did not come out of hunger, his own stores were deep, but out of a need to disprove the absurd rumors. He found a small line of his neighbors waiting quietly near Elspeth's cabin. When his turn came, he stood before her, his face a mask of stern disbelief. Elspeth met his gaze and handed him a small, warm roll. He took it, his gloved fingers registering its impossible heat. He broke it in half, the steam ghosting up into the frigid air. He raised a piece to his lips and ate it. The taste, the perfectly gelatinized crumb, the complex flavor from the slow fermentation, the shatteringly crisp crust, was an irrefutable truth. It was the best bread he had ever eaten. He looked from the roll in his hand to Elspeth's calm, waiting face, and then to the scarred granite face of the mountain behind her. The folly, he realized, had not been hers. He lowered his head. "You were right, Mistress Muir," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its bluster and certainty. "I was a fool." In the hard weeks of isolation that followed, Elspeth's hidden bakery became the unlikely heart of Providence Gulch. The town's survival, it turned out, depended on the very woman it had cast out. A system of trade emerged, organic and fair. A quart of firewood for a week's worth of bread. A cured ham for a daily supply for a large family. Mending clothes, sharpening tools, tending to the sick, all were traded for the warm, life-giving loaves that came from the mountain oven. Elspeth, however, did not hoard the secret to her success. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and revealing a green and hungry world, she began to share her knowledge. She took the blacksmith to her chamber and showed him the design, explaining the principle of thermal mass, of how the earth held the heat. He, a man who understood the properties of heat and iron, grasped it immediately. Together, they designed a larger, more efficient oven for his forge, one that would save him immense amounts of charcoal. She showed other families how to dig their root cellars deeper, into the hillside, and line them with clay to keep their stores from freezing. She taught them to see the mountain not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. The memory of the stone became part of the town's vocabulary. The widow's oven, as it came to be known, was used for another 50 years, a permanent and beloved fixture of Providence Gulch. Elspeth Muir lived a long life, respected not just for her baking, but for her quiet, profound wisdom. Her son, Jamie, never took to the mines. He became a builder, a man who crafted homes that worked with the landscape instead of fighting it, his structures known for their warmth and solidity. The techniques Elspeth had introduced, born from an old-world memory and a new-world desperation, fundamentally changed how the community survived. The brutal winters still came, but they were no longer met with just grim endurance, but with an intelligent partnership with the very earth they lived on. The small bakery, carved into the rock out of exile and shame, became a foundational story for the town, a legend passed down through generations. It was a testament to the quiet innovator who, when ostracized and dismissed, had listened not to the loud voices of men, but to the deep, warm, and patient memory of the mountain.